Again, I would want to just remind you, I'm sure most of you remember what this weekend is, but Memorial Day weekend. I'm just curious, how many do we have here? Would you raise your hands that served our country here? Just kind of, take note and thank you. We need to take time to remember the sacrifices of others, in a special way the sacrifice for our freedom. To say thank you once a year is really probably not enough. We should say it on a frequent basis. And I would also, I'm a pastor, I've got to make a theological application to everything. You know that, right? But again, as we remember Memorial Day weekend, we, in a special way, need to remember the sacrifice of Christ for our freedom. And we actually spiritually have a Memorial Day how often? Every week. Sabbath is a Memorial Day. It is a memorial of two things. A memorial, a reminder that we were created, and that we were created in the image of God. And it is also a memorial, a reminder of redemption. Only two times in the Bible where it talks about Jesus, God, resting. He rested on the seventh day from the work of creation. And on that Friday afternoon, when He said, "It is finished," He rested in the grave on Sabbath. And then when He rose again, what did He do? He went to work. Maybe that might tell us something that, after a restful, blessed Sabbath, we need to go to work. But anyway, probably, getting into trouble here. Let's move on. Have you ever been desperate? Now, come on. Some of you are, not raising your eye. To a greater or lesser degree, I'm guessing we all have for something. Maybe, it could be anything, a lot of things you can imagine, and maybe to varying degrees, how we would define desperate. We talk about this being Memorial Day weekend. It was back a couple 100+ years ago that there was a country that was desperate, people that were desperate for freedom. And they came to a new world, and they set up a constitution where they said God had created all men with certain inalienable rights, that all men were created equal, and that all ought to have religious freedom. They ought to be able to choose to read and to study God's Word and follow the convictions of their heart, not the convictions or the force and the laws of the states, of the government. A country that grew up on the principle of religious freedom. Sadly, we're told in the Bible that that is going to change. There is going to come a time when all are going to try to force their convictions on others. We don't have time to go into all that. That's not the sermon this morning. But if you'd like to study about it, be happy to explain in Revelation what it talks about. But again, that freedom that we have, that we need to cherish, that we need to appreciate. Freedom. Maybe desperate for money. Maybe for many different reasons. Maybe, I don't know how I'm going to pay the rent. I don't know how I'm going to make my car payment. I don't know how I'm going to buy my next meal. I don't know. Different levels of desperation. Now, I don't want to trivialize it here, but I will say, that I used to keep a couple of those dollar coins, 2 or 3 of them in my car, just in case, I needed, to make it to Taco Bell and the wallet was empty. To make some plans. But you don't like to get in that situation where you don't have any resources. Maybe there are some who are desperate for answers. It is interesting that in this world, people will look everywhere for answers except the one place they can find them, won't they? They're willing to look to Hollywood, to evolution, to science, to all sorts of things. And yet the one place where we can find answers seems to be often the last place that we look. Maybe it's desperate to be somewhere. Being Memorial Day, it always is a good story when they show some veteran that makes it home for a wedding, for some special occasion. Didn't look like it was going to be able to happen, but I don't know, usually those are the ones, on whatever the internet that, I just have to watch. There's not a whole lot of, there out there that I really want to see. But those are those special ones, to be somewhere, to see someone. Maybe to help a loved one going through a difficult or trying time, going through an illness, whatever it may be. To be desperate to help someone you love and you care about. To save a child. We hear those stories every now and then about a rescue and all the effort that is made to save someone, especially an infant, a child. Our story this morning. We've been looking at this passage and some of the different miracles that Jesus does. And we actually looked at the middle of this passage last Sabbath. Now we're going to look at the beginning and the end. Mark chapter 5, verse 21. Now when Jesus had crossed over again by boat to the other side, a great multitude gathered to him, and he was by the sea. And behold, one of the rulers of the synagogue came, Jairus by name, and when he saw him, he fell at his feet and begged him earnestly, saying, My little daughter lies at the point of death. Come and lay your hand on her, that she may be healed, and she will live. Does it sound like maybe there's just a little bit of desperation there? So Jesus went with him, and a great multitude followed and thronged him. Jairus. Is Jairus desperate? I'm guessing that probably all of us would say no. Probably not anybody that would say no. Everybody would say yes. Why is it that he is desperate? Well, the story is very clear. His daughter is dying. She's at the point of death. Now, there's part of me that wonders, was this something that came on suddenly? That was unexpected? Was this something that had been developing, getting worse and worse, and now it's at such a critical stage that Jairus decides, well, there is no other option. I better go and see if Jesus will help. Now, I realize sometimes we don't have time. Everything comes on all of a sudden. But I wonder how often, we think, well, it's not that bad. I can handle it myself. If it gets really bad, then I'll ask God to help. And we wait until things get in a desperate situation. But he comes to Jesus, he falls at his feet, and he begs Jesus to come and to heal his daughter. Who is Jairus? He's the ruler of the synagogue. One of the synagogues there. The ruler of the synagogue and Jesus are really close, right? As Hertz would say, not exactly. There are some issues. What was the attitude of the rulers of the synagogue, of those people towards Jesus? The Bible gives us some examples you probably know. But Luke 13, verse 14, Jesus was in the synagogue and he healed on the Sabbath. Now, I don't know if this is the same ruler or a different ruler. The Bible doesn't tell us his name, whether it's Jairus or somebody else. But the ruler of the synagogue answered with indignation because Jesus had healed on the Sabbath and said to the crowd, there are 6 days on which men ought to work. Therefore come and be healed on one of them and not on the Sabbath day. Isn't it ironic? The Sabbath that is a memorial of God's creative power and God's redemptive power, and God does something to restore His image in one of His children, and people think that God is breaking the Sabbath. Maybe the problem is still there today, that we have really missed the purpose of the Sabbath is to go out and by the grace of God help restore people to a relationship with Jesus. But again, the ruler of the synagogue is not happy with Jesus because of his activities. John chapter 9, verses 19 to 23. You remember the story in John chapter 9. There's a blind man that Jesus heals. Ironically, do you remember when Jesus healed this man too? On the Sabbath. Interesting how many of the issues that Jesus had with the religious leaders is because He was doing good on the Sabbath. You know, they would have been perfectly happy if He would have gone home and just taken a nap all day. Now I've started meddling, hadn't I? I'll move on. But again, they call the boy's parents and they ask him, saying, "Is this your son who was born blind? How then does he see?" His parents answered them and said, "We know that this is our son and that he was born blind. This is what we're sure of. This is what we know. This is our son, and yes, he was born blind. But by what means he now sees, we do not know, or who opened his eyes, we do not know. He is of age. Ask him. He will speak for himself." Now, I want to be careful here. But how many parents, if you have the opportunity to speak for your children, say, you know, they can speak for themselves, I don't want to speak for them? I've got a suspicion that often we're quite willing to speak for our children. There's a reason why they didn't want to answer that question. You probably know what the reason is. His parents said these things because they what? Feared the Jews. For the Jews had agreed already that if anyone confessed that he was Christ, he would be put out of the synagogue. Therefore, his parents said, "He is of age, ask him." It wasn't because they didn't know what had happened. It wasn't because they didn't have an answer. It was because they were afraid of what would happen if they spoke what they believed. I wonder, are we ever afraid to speak what we know, to tell others what God has done for us because we're afraid somebody may be upset? Now, I want to be careful. We should be careful. It's not our job to go stick our religion in somebody's face. But also, we should not be ashamed of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And if someone asks me a reason for my faith, I shouldn't be embarrassed to tell them. But sometimes the reality is we are. John chapter 12, verses 42 and 43. Nevertheless, among the rulers, many believed in him, but because of the Pharisees, they did not confess him, lest they should be what? Put out of the synagogue. And there's another reason it gives. For they loved what? The praise of men more than the praise of God. It would be nice to say that the problem in Jesus' day is no longer a problem today. But I wonder, how often are we afraid to speak for Jesus because we're afraid of what people might say and what they might think? Now, there's a right way to be concerned about that, but sometimes it's just an excuse. Is Jairus desperate? He comes to Jesus. He begs Jesus to come and to heal his daughter. Now, do you kind of get a picture? This is the ruler of the synagogue, and we've given you a little image here. You kind of already knew, but how the leadership felt about confessing Jesus, about going to him, about believing in him, and yet Jairus is willing to come to Jesus and fall at his feet and beg for his daughter. He is willing to risk everything. His job, his reputation. Why? Why is Jairus willing to risk everything? Because his daughter is near to the point of death. He is willing to do anything to save his daughter. I wonder if maybe some of us ought to be a little more desperate than we are. Are we desperate? Are we desperate for our family, for our children? Are we desperate to see them healed, to see them saved? What are you willing to risk? Are you willing to risk your job? Are you willing to risk your reputation? Are you willing to risk everything for Jesus? For salvation? What are you willing to do? What are you willing to give? Are we desperate for our family, for our children, for there to be healing, physical, spiritual? Are we desperate to see our children, our family, our loved ones saved? Are we desperate for them to know Jesus? Like I say, maybe we need to be a little more desperate as Christians. What are you willing to risk for your children, for your children's salvation? Now, I'll just warn you ahead of time, if you want to put on your steel-toed boots or plug your ears or whatever, the pastor's going to start meddling again. You know, it's kind of sad that our Sabbath school rooms are not full every week. Well, you know, it's really early to have to get up on a Sabbath morning. Well, feel free to go to bed earlier on Friday night. Well, but my kids don't want to come. All sorts of reasons, and some of them I understand. I realize it's not easy. But do we have a desperation to introduce our children to Jesus, to put them in a spiritual environment where the most important thing is their relationship with Jesus, their salvation? Do we take time to study and pray with them while they're willing to study and pray with us? And you know, the school year's over, but Adventist education doesn't ever end. It's important. We have an Adventist school, Adobe Adventist Christian School, and you know, you hear some people talk about it. Well, you know, it's not the same quality education. Well, you know what? I agree, it's not the same quality. I believe it's better. Now, you can believe whatever you want, and that's fine. But ultimately, now, you know, can you find any school that will score higher than some of our schools? Yeah, you will. Of course, you'll find a lot more that score lower. The majority score lower. But the real truth is, folks, what is the purpose of educating your children? Is it to prepare them to succeed in this world and miss out on the next? If it is, then there's an educational system that's set up for that. But if your goal, if your desire is to prepare your children for the world that is to come, then I would recommend Adventist Christian education. Now, I'd like to tell you, you know, if you put your kids in our school, they will always love and serve and honor Jesus. I'd like to tell you that. But if I did, you'd know I was lying. It doesn't always work. But the reality is, you know, I don't think there's anybody there when we get to heaven that's going to say, you know, I wish I wouldn't have spent so much on my children's Christian education. But I do think there's going to be some that are going to look back and say, you know, I invested my money here and here and here, and it should have been in my children's education. Educating them for eternity to be saved, not educating them to be lost. You know, some, well, it's too expensive, and I realize it is expensive. But I'll also be honest, if you go out and you check out other private schools and education, we're actually pretty cheap, pretty inexpensive. But you know, here in Arizona, we also have a benefit of a church that is supportive, and I'm thankful we have a church that supports Christian education. I asked our treasurer to give me a few numbers of the budget, and you can see the number in the bulletin. I didn't put that there for the total budget every month, just some percentages. But our Apache Junction church pays 44% of the tuition of the cost for every child that goes to school there. Tax credit. I know sometimes people get tired of hearing the pastor every Sabbath morning talk about tax credit. And I'm sorry if that bothers you. But you know, we have an opportunity here. And you know, I really wish that 31% was 100%. We have that opportunity. 31% comes from that. 11% this year. I don't know that it stays that every year because it varies, but 11% from our rummage sales. 10%. That's what parents actually pay out of their pocket. Now, I realize parents collect tax credits, they do other things, but of this year, that's what actually came out of parents' pockets. Now, I'll be honest with you, I wish that was zero. Although there is part of me that, I hear that voice of my mother from way back, that if you don't pay something for it, you don't appreciate it. But, I still wish it was zero. Because we have opportunities where we could take care of it. Well, no, it's not too expensive if you're committed. It's a challenge, it's difficult. I realize there are things that make it complicated. And then there's 4% other areas that it comes. I'm thankful that we have a church that supports Adventist education. And I believe that we will only fully understand the value of it on the other side of eternity. But you know what? I want to be desperate. I want to do everything I can. I hope all of us do, to make sure that our children have every opportunity to know Jesus. Jesus sums it up a little differently. Then he said to his disciples, if anyone desires to come after me, let him what? Deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever denies to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. For what profit is it to a man if he gains the whole world and loses his own soul? Or what will a man give in exchange for his soul? My friends, if I can use a little bit of a liberal paraphrase, what profit is it for a man if he gets into the most prestigious academic institutions in the world and turns his back on God? Now, folks, please don't misunderstand me. I think that all of our schools ought to give a quality academic, scholastic education. But the most important thing is to prepare people to know, to love, to serve Jesus, to be prepared for eternity. For the Son of Man will come in the glory of his Father and with his angels, and then he will reward each one according to his works. That same passage, it's interesting, it's just a little different in the Gospel of Mark, that last verse. For whoever is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of him the Son of Man will also be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels. My friends, I don't want God to be ashamed of me when he comes. But the way to make sure that doesn't happen is for me not to be ashamed of him, of my relationship with Jesus. Jairus, back to our story, he's desperate for Jesus to heal his daughter, and Jesus is moving slowly. He's barely making any promise, and then all of a sudden he stops in the middle of the way and asks that question, who touched me? We looked at that story last Sabbath. But I can imagine Jairus is desperate, and Jesus stopped. Who touched me? All these people are thronging everywhere. And Jairus is thinking in his mind, my little girl is going to die if we don't get there soon. And you're asking, who touched me? Don't you know what's important? I wonder, do we ever feel that way sometimes, if we're really honest, that God really doesn't understand what's important in our lives? But you see, God really does understand what's important. God understands that anytime somebody reaches out in faith, God is going to stop and respond. You will never reach out in faith and be ignored by Jesus. I may not recognize it at the moment. I may not see it then. Other people may not notice it. They may not perceive it. But let me tell you, every time someone reaches out in faith, God notices. He pays attention. And he's willing to stop whatever he's doing for that touch of faith. You see, Jesus is never desperate. You may feel like Jesus doesn't understand the urgency, the seriousness of the moment. But you see, Jesus sees beyond the urgency and the seriousness and the desperation to the solution. The story goes on. While he was still speaking, some came from the ruler of the synagogue's house who said, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any farther?" As soon as Jesus heard the word that was spoken, he said to the ruler of the synagogue, "Do not be afraid, only believe." From desperate to hopeless, your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any farther? It's too late. There's nothing even Jesus can do now. Why trouble Jesus anymore? Have you ever felt like, things have gotten to the point, there's no point in me praying anymore? Nothing's happened so far. Apparently God's not going to do anything. It's too late. There are people that are out there that are happy to take, there's no point in religion. Your faith is pointless at this point. Just give up. What troubles Jesus? It's not storms. Storms don't trouble Jesus. We looked at the story. They're going across the ocean. They're about to sink. The disciples are panic-stricken. Everybody else is. And what is Jesus doing? He's sleeping in the boat because, you see, storms don't trouble Jesus. Because Jesus knows He can stand up and stretch out His hands and say, "Peace, be still," and the storm will stop. Jesus gets across the sea, and what does He find? The demoniac, this man who is possessed by legions of demons. And the disciples all flee and they run, but they notice that Jesus is not running. Because you see, demons don't trouble Jesus either. Because when He tells them to go, they have to go. Jairus gets news. Your daughter is dead. Don't trouble Jesus anymore. But you see, death doesn't trouble Jesus either. The only thing that I can find that seems to trouble and disturb Jesus is our disbelief. It is our lack of faith. And He reminds Jairus, "Do not be afraid, only believe." And He permitted no one to follow Him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. Then He came to the house of the ruler of the synagogue and saw a tumult and those who wept and wailed loudly. And when He came in, He said, "Why make this commotion and weep? The child is not dead, but sleeping." And they what? Ridiculed Him. Do we ever ridicule Jesus? Now, I know you don't want to raise your hand and you don't admit to it, but do we ever ridicule Jesus? I'll just warn you again, the pastor's going to start meddling, so you may want to, plug your ears. But I wonder, do we ridicule Jesus? Jesus says to remember the Sabbath day. Well, I can't take that risk because if I honor the Sabbath, it may cost me my job. Are we really saying, God, you can't live up to your end of the bargain? I can't really trust you. You don't really understand what you're talking about. Well, if I give my tithes and my offerings, I won't have enough. And I understand, because logically it doesn't make sense that 90, 85, 80% actually goes farther than 100%. It doesn't make sense logically. But Jesus says, "Test me and see if I will not open the windows of heaven." Do we ever ridicule Jesus in our lives, our lack of faith, lack of trust? I'm thankful that in spite of that, Jesus still works in our lives. And they ridiculed Him. But when He had put them all outside, He took the father and the mother of the child and those who were with Him and entered where the child was lying. And he took the child by the hand and said to her, Talitha cumi, which is translated, little girl, I say to you, what? Arise. And what do you think is going to happen? She's going to wake up. She's going to arise immediately. The girl arose and walked, for she was 12 years of age, and they were overcome with great amazement. Now, on one level, I understand it. You know, if you see Jesus raise somebody from the dead, you're going to be amazed. And yet, should you really? Should I really be amazed that the creator of the universe, that the one who breathed into Adam the breath of life, can tell a little girl, wake up, and she wakes up? Should I be amazed that Jesus can do anything and everything He has promised? I shouldn't be, but often I am amazed by the grace of Jesus. But He commanded them strictly that no one should know it, and said that something should be given her to eat. You know, I find that fascinating, that little tidbit that Mark puts in there. You know, not only does Jesus raise us from the dead, you know, that ought to be enough, right? But you know, Jesus is always thinking of even the little things. You know, she's going to be hungry. You need to feed her. She's been sick, she's been ill, she's actually been asleep, she's been dead. She needs to be fed. You know the story of Mary and Martha and Lazarus. And Jesus hesitates to go there. He waits a lot longer than He did with Jairus and his daughter. He waits 4 days. And when He gets there, then Martha said to Him, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Remember, Jesus is not troubled by death. Jesus is troubled by disbelief. That's the problem, not death. But even now I know that whatever you ask of God, God will give you. So Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. Now you remember, what did Martha just say? Whatever you ask of God, He'll give you. And Jesus says, your brother's going to rise again. What is Martha's response? I know he'll rise again at the resurrection at the last day. Now wait a minute, does she really believe that whatever Jesus says will happen? Well, eventually, but not right now. Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me, though he may die, he shall live. And whoever lives and believes in me shall never die. Do you believe this? Jesus' question to Martha is a question to you and to me. It is a question for us. Do we really believe that Jesus is the resurrection and the life? That everything that Jesus said will come true? Are you afraid of something? Are you afraid of some storms? Maybe you've got some going on in your life, and you don't know what the answer is, and you're fighting desperately, and you've forgotten that Jesus is with you, resting peacefully, because Jesus is not afraid of the storm. He's got the storm covered. You just need to ask Him and trust Him. Are you afraid of demons, what Satan is doing? And certainly, folks, there are concerns when we look about in the world and we see all that Satan and the hosts of evil are doing. But the bottom line is, if I am with Jesus, Satan cannot touch me unless Jesus allows it. And if Jesus allows it, there is a reason. I may not know that reason until I can ask Him face to face, but I believe with all my heart when I ask Jesus the reason, why did you allow this to happen to me or to my loved one or in this circumstance or this? And Jesus pulls back the curtain and He says, here was my plan. I'm going to look and I'm going to say, you know, Lord, I wouldn't have wanted it any other way. But until then, I have to live by faith. Do not be afraid, only believe. Are you afraid of death? You know, all of us to a greater or lesser degree have experienced it. Loved ones may be very close, maybe not so close. But Jesus is not afraid of death because He is the resurrection and the life. His concern is whether or not you and I will believe in Him, whether or not we are willing to reach out in faith and touch Jesus. Do you believe? Do you believe in Jesus? Do you believe in His life, that He came and lived for you, that He fulfilled all the righteous requirements of the law, that only His life is sufficient to meet the righteousness that God requires? Do you believe in His death, that He died the death that you deserve, and that you can have the life that He deserved? Do you believe in His grace? Do you believe in His power, that power that can calm the storm, that power that can cast out demons, that power that can bring life to the dead? Do you believe that power can change your life? Do you believe that He is the resurrection and the life? Do you believe that He's coming to take us home? Do you believe that that tomb really is empty? That Jesus spent a couple of days there. You know, a Friday night and a Saturday night, and Sunday morning He rose and He said, I'm going to my Father and your Father. And one day He is coming to empty every tomb, every grave that holds those who are willing to not be afraid, but only believe in Him. Do you believe that He's coming soon to take you home? How is your faith this morning? Is your hope in Jesus, in His righteousness and His righteousness alone? Would you like to accept Jesus by faith? Would you like to accept Him as your Savior and as your Lord? Would you like to rededicate yourself to sharing the good news, to sharing the blessed hope that we have in Jesus, to telling the world about the everlasting gospel, that very soon Jesus may come to take us to the place He has prepared for us? Our gracious Father, we are thankful for the hope that we have in Jesus. And Father, I would ask right here, right now, if there is any that don't know that hope, that maybe are doubting, that are struggling, that they would say, Lord, I believe, help Thou mine unbelief. That each and every one of us would commit our hearts and our lives to Jesus. That we would experience that hope, and that we would be used by You in sharing that blessed hope with all the world, that one day very soon You may come to take us to the place You have prepared for us. We look forward to that day because we believe in Jesus. Amen.